Good evening and welcome to this July edition of the Australian-New Zealand Women's Human Rights Campaign webinar. My name is Janet Fraser and I'm a volunteer with the Feminist Legal Clinic. I live and work on the land of the Darug and Gundungurra people outside of Sydney. Wherever you're coming from this evening, we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging in Aboriginal nations across the continent. Tonight we'll be dealing with Articles 4 and 5 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. Article 4 is about freedom of opinion and expression, and 5 is about women's right to peaceful assembly. We have 4 speakers tonight whom I'll introduce in turn. Our first speaker is Anna Kerr. Anna lives and works on the land of the Gadigal and Wangal Peoples of the Eora Nation, whose way of life has been devastated by colonisation. Anna is a founder and the principal solicitor of Feminist Legal Clinic, and her legal practice is equally split between domestic violence and discrimination cases. In recent years, Anna has also held a variety of other positions, including co-chair of the Women and Girls' Rights Subcommittee of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, elected member of the steering group of the Equality Rights Alliance, committee member of the Edna Ryan Committee, member of the New South Wales Women's Electoral Lobby Pro-Choice Alliance, and member of the New South Wales Greens Women's Working Group. In all these positions, she has experienced aggressive moves to oust her as a result of her efforts to defend women's sex-based rights. She will talk tonight about her latest experience with being cancelled by misguided forces for progress. So Anna, can I ask you to say a little introduction and give us some details of your involvement in advocating for women's sex-based rights? Thanks.
Well, my background is obviously as a solicitor. I was admitted in 1992, so I've been practicing as a solicitor for almost 30 years. And throughout my career, I've worked almost entirely in the community justice sector, beginning with the Aboriginal Legal Service, and my last paid employment was with Women's Legal Services. So that's given me detailed knowledge of the deficiencies in the Australian legal system, which often leave women and children exposed to male violence and abuse. So in 2017, with a group of other women, I incorporated Feminist Legal Clinic, and we then applied for an accommodation grant from the City of Sydney Council, which enabled us to set up an office in Glebe. And I operate this service with the assistance of many volunteer women, including Janet, for instance, who's a current member of our management committee, and Bronwyn has been a member in the past, and many other women, no doubt, who are attending tonight. About half our casework relates to domestic violence work, which I include under that support work in the family court, and the other half is sort of discrimination and human rights law. So that's my background.
Anna, what made you first realise transgenderism is a threat to women's rights?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a gradual awakening, to be honest. At first I thought, like many women, that it was a minor concern, since I assumed there were so few of these marginalised individuals and that they were much to be pitied, and it really wasn't something we should give a lot of attention to. But then I became active. I was focusing my attentions on activism in the women's sector. And so in about 2013, I joined a community organisation, a women's organisation. I'm trying not to mention the names. A lot of you will know which organisation I mean. But anyhow, there were attempts to amend the constitution to read people who live as women rather than simply women. And there was a bit of a showdown over that. So then I started realising that it was serious. I'm also a member of a political party, and I was quite astounded that during a discussion about the decriminalisation of abortion, that someone claimed the language was transphobic because men have babies too. And I thought that was pretty bizarre. And most concern was that it derailed the discussion. But even more bizarre were the apologies that followed. And that was when I realised that this was a seriously effective means of dismantling feminist activism. I was even more appalled when the women's working group that I was on they then voted in a person with a penis to be their convener and showered him with praise for his courage, even though he was maintaining his male persona for business purposes. Basically, every time I think there is something that no one could take seriously, I've been shown to be wrong. And to that extent, my expectations of human intelligence have significantly lowered. And really, I guess, I think like everyone, we keep wondering, when will peak trans hit? Will it be the weightlifter, Laurel Hubbard? What will it take? And I think we're still wondering what it will take before the world turns around on this.
Is there an area of activity in which you focus your efforts to resist gender identity ideology? Where has that taken you?
Well, it's taken me, I was going to say, to destitution. No, it hasn't. I mean, it's just resulted in me being evicted from my office and being defamed and marginalised within my sector. So I'm probably unemployable. But no, it's actually been an enjoyable ride. I mean, I focus my efforts on providing legal services and law reform activities, including international human rights work. I enjoy doing this work. I think this is an extraordinarily fascinating issue. If you put aside how potentially devastating it is for humanity. If people would like to know more about what we do, you can check out Feminist Legal Clinic's website, because we've got all our submissions and articles and presentations up there. We've also have a news blog, and we post extracts from news reports that you might not otherwise see, because the Australian media, of course, is largely censoring what's taking place in regard to this issue. So yeah, that's where I've been focusing my efforts. And yes, you might have seen that where it's taken me is that just recently the City of Sydney have given us a notice to vacate.
Can you tell us a little about the opposition you've met and how this is impacting you personally?
Yeah, you ran through a bit of it in the introduction. I think I gave you a big list of all these positions that I've held on bodies, such as co-chair of the Women and Girls' Rights Subcommittee of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights, and steering group of Equality Rights Alliance, Edna Ryan Committee, New South Wales Women's Electoral Lobby, and various. And of course, all of these groups have taken aggressive action to have me kicked out. Sometimes even when I haven't even mentioned the subject, because someone saw my website. And of course, the latest action is by the City of Sydney Council. Look, it's probably not as devastating as some of the earlier experiences, because I've actually received a lot of expressions of support from people in the last few weeks, despite some of the media coverage not being terribly flattering. I've been surprised that I haven't received any abuse, knock wood, and I've received a lot of donations and a lot of expressions of support from all sorts of people, from a very wide range of people. Some of them I don't have politically much in common with, others, of course, I do. Look, I was expecting it. We had a year's notice that they were going to kick us out, and I made a calculated judgment that it was well worth losing our office to finally receive some media coverage of the fact that there are feminist women who do not support extreme trans activism. I'm very frustrated that we still can't crack. I mean, the Herald has run one article on page 8, which was not very flattering, but at least it was something, because the Herald, really, there's just so much censorship taking place, unless it's the far right media, who of course are only too happy to run a story detracting from Clover Moore. But really, like the ABC and the Herald and the Age, they just won't touch this topic if they can avoid it. But look, I had no intention of really giving into this kind of bullying, because the work that I'm doing it unpaid. Why on earth would I be dictated to about what sort of work I can do? Fortuitously, my eldest son has moved out of home, and I've been able to fit the filing cabinets into his bedroom, and working from home is basically mandatory at the moment, pretty much, with the lockdown in Sydney. So, it's really not a big deal for me. And as I say, this time round, I've probably had more support than I did with all those earlier battles that I mentioned, which some of them were very distressing.
What are your next steps for the Feminist Legal Clinic in exile? And what do you think attendees could be doing?
Look, there was a wonderful recent victory in New Zealand, and a lot of people are saying, well, are you going to do a judicial review? It would mean of the decision by the City of Sydney Council is what I'm referring to here. However, the legal issues are somewhat different, and even if we were to win. It would be a bit futile since our tenancy expires next year anyhow. And I don't believe we'd be able to legally compel council to renew our accommodation grant. And furthermore, there'd be a risk of incurring a huge costs order against us. And it would also take a lot of time and resources. And frankly, we've got other better cases on which we could expend our efforts. I have had legal advice from a number of barristers on this, and I'll be speaking to another one next week. But look, regardless of that, I have plans to agitate over this issue further. I mean, I think the most important thing is the media coverage. So really, in a sense, any sort of legal action is so that you get a bit of coverage. Trying to get the media to report on this, to report that there are feminists and lesbian women and left-wing people who are not happy about it. I think that's actually the priority. Other things that I'm doing, for instance, today I've sent a letter to UN Women for the Commission on the Status of Women. So I've sent them a letter about the violation specific. I've sent them a number of letters actually, but I've sent one specifically about the violation of our rights to freedom of speech as human rights defenders. And I've got some other legal plans. You know, I'm going to do a GIPA request, which is like freedom of information, to obtain now as many details as I can about the nature of these complaints. I'd like to verify how many complainants there were. I imagine they won't give me the details, but they won't give me the names, I don't imagine. I'll try, but I'd just like to know how many there really were, because there were hundreds of women, thanks to the Women's Human Rights Campaign, the international group, which I'd really want to say. I mean, they did a letter that's had over 900 signatures that was sent to council. And then dozens and dozens of women locally as well have had handwritten letters, you know, written personal letters to members of council, the staff and councillors. I want to thank everyone who did that, but it was completely ignored by council. So I'd really like to see what we were up against on the other side, because they've never provided any details of the complaints that were actually made. Like, they haven't given me a copy with redacted details or anything like that. It's just been, there have been complaints. So yeah, I'll keep plugging on and thank everyone for the support and ongoing support that they've been giving through social media and by writing to council.
Madeline Valdor lives on Guringai country with her partner and 2 children. She works in public health. She's a trained counsellor and director of a civil society organisation focused on maternal child wellbeing. Thanks, Madeline.
Thanks, Janet.
Would you like to give us some details of your involvement in advocating for women's sex-based rights?
So I'm working in an unpaid capacity doing mother-to-mother peer support. I run an advocacy group that creates public and government awareness of the role of successful breastfeeding as the single most important public health measure a country can implement. Breastfeeding is an act which is unique to women and children. It's an area in which women face a wide range of barriers and discrimination on the basis of being female. Attitudes towards infant feeding are affected by commercial influence, predatory marketing practices, as well as ignorance amongst healthcare professionals and government malaise. The Australian government acts as if what breastfeeding mothers produce doesn't count. We advocate for breastfeeding and unpaid carers' work to be recorded numerically in the GDP figures, and thank you for having me here tonight.
What made you first realise transgenderism is a threat to women's rights?
First realised there was a conflict between the claims of trans activists and the rights of women who are mothers when I saw language changing. I spoke with women and I realised this was happening in many organisations nationally and internationally. The active avoidance of the term mother in publications has become so profound in the West that in some instances, maternal health workers are asking their organisations, are we still allowed to say mother? Many of these maternal child health organisations were set up to be spaces where the mothering role could be discussed and where female reproduction was centred. Now, what has been happening is that even in those spaces, speaking out about the female body and reproduction and mothers is actually being silenced. This is happening through the policing of language, especially on social media, a lack of guidance and transparency from senior figures in these organisations, and a general sense that many organisations simply lack the courage to maintain their exclusive focus on women under fire from the false claim that focusing on mothers hurts others. From a child rights perspective, we are actually losing the ability to describe the person who is most important to an infant. And if we cannot name the mother-infant dyad, we can't protect it.
Is there an area of activity in which you focus your efforts to resist gender identity ideology? Where has that taken you?
Even the act of women having these conversations is resistance. Mothers meeting together, talking about mothering is so subversive and feminist. Women talking about mothering is sharing knowledge and learning. Mothers themselves are organising discussions. Many are being supportive of each other and holding space for one another, especially after negative interactions on social media or in friendships or in their place of work. Many mothers themselves are resisting change that is undermining their rights. I know of one mother who wrote to the board of a woman-focused organisation, and she said, I asked a reasonable question on your social media page and I didn't get an answer, and comments were closed and I've been blocked. Why? So it's worth mentioning here that many organisations appear to be operating in the online space without any accountability. These organisations often have good social media policies that are not being enforced. The moderators are often those who put up their hands and they don't have any specific training. They can choose to moderate in a way that aligns with their own personal political views rather than following the policies of the organisation. And some of these organisations are explicitly non-political, and yet women are being silenced and having words changed and being deleted. I've had conversations with some women who are expressing their discomfort with the new terminology that makes them invisible. For example, breastfeeding families, birthing person, lactating individual. But like-minded mothers are linking up and finding each other in the spaces that are left for them to do so. And I would say there is a lot of quiet resistance.
What kind of opposition have you faced and how is that impacting you?
In my circle, friends have reported being deplatformed for refusing to use sex-neutral language to support mothers. Those questioning linguistic changes have been called a bigot and a transphobe when they raise ethical questions about the separation of the mother-baby dyad, of babies from their mothers. They've reported being profiled by colleagues and had their interactions on social media catalogued and circulated widely with the intention of causing personal and professional embarrassment. They have requested that others have requested that they be removed from organisations because they're not prioritising a gendered language ahead of a sexed language. They've been blocked, deleted, had formal complaints made about them. Advocates for sex-based language are being told by a loud group that if they do not do what they claim is inclusive, then they will be excluded. So the impact of this is that I believe it's led to a lot of infighting in a lot of organisations. Volunteers are being pushed out or feeling like they have no option to stay. And the spaces set up for mothers have become quite hostile. Mothers who are working to try and support other mothers are not being supported.
What are your next steps and what do you think attendees could be doing?
So there are a lot of women who are concerned about this, particularly in maternity care, because they can see how changing the language is a problem. So I would say keep talking, keep discussions going, be questioning, write to board members, managers, leadership. I mean, hold these organisations accountable, find like-minded women, go forward as a group, maintain that sex language is appropriate and necessary. Create your own space where it's okay to have these conversations, and it's more difficult to get kicked out of your own space. Don't underestimate the value of just planting seeds, opening up the conversation a little bit. There's a million ways to be involved. They don't all require you to be public and visible. If you're not in a position to speak publicly, support others who are. Buy their books, share a picture on social media of you reading J.K. Rowling. Send other women messages of support. And I don't want it to seem like I'm coming across as saying, just be nice or be kind. But something I value in my approach is to kind of get my counselling skills going. And when I interact with others who feel differently, I try to work out how I can maintain a relationship with them. So, you know, how do I stay in relationship with people who think differently to me and feel differently to me? There's a lot of people who are trying to close down these conversations, and I'm wondering, how can we open them up again? There are a lot of women who are not sure how they feel about it, or perhaps they know that they feel uncomfortable with genderism. And there are a lot of women who are going along with it, and maybe they don't know why they're going along with it. So it's a complex issue, and we need to create spaces for those women where they can come and ask questions and develop their ideas and not be punished for saying the wrong thing. For some women, advancing these ideas means taking them offline. I know one teacher who refuses to discuss this on social media, but has a lot of impact with her students face to face. So there are so many spaces silencing women and closing down discussion. I feel it's important to build new spaces where women can talk, and perhaps consider the idea that many people are caught up in this who do genuinely believe that they are doing something good for the global population by changing this language. Some of them are well-meaning, well-intentioned individuals, and they feel they're doing the appropriate thing without full consideration of the unintended consequences of using this different language. So instead of engaging with them in heated arguments where people get called bigots and get cancelled, I'm looking to build new spaces and to find other ways to keep the conversation going.
Our next speaker is Jessica Hoyle. Jessica lives in the Stony Creek Nation of Lutruwita, Tasmania, on the land of the Leader-Remerina people. Born and bred in Launceston, she used to work in hospitality and now works for herself at home, where she's also a carer for her mum. Hi, Jessica. Could you give us a few details of your involvement in advocating for women's sex-based rights?
Well, to be quite honest, all I really wanted to do was run a drag king event for females only. Because there's nothing here that caters for lesbian women, and I really wanted to have some events, and I was really hoping to meet Cinderella, you know, but Sarah Bolt, she said no. So, and said it was unlawful for me to have a single-sex event when I applied for that exemption, because Tasmania, you aren't allowed to have single-sex events. We used to have them, and then Rodney Croom and Martine Delaney lobbied the government to change it all a number of years ago. So we can't have single-sex events in Tasmania. And because of self-ID laws, you know, we have to take in biological males that think that they could be something else, and it's really not that fair at all.
Jessica, can I go to you for the same question? What made you first realise transgenderism is a threat to women's rights?
I hit peak around about Mardi Gras time, about a year or two back, when they cancelled Ariel Scarcella. Now, Ariel Scarcella is quite a famous lesbian YouTube blogger, and they cancelled her from Mardi Gras, and she appeared on Sky News, and I watched that, and I was utterly upset, and from then I just stopped having anything to do with anything LGBTQITA++. I just stopped going, and I stopped having anything to do with anybody. And I think that was the last thing that happened that really piqued me. It's always lesbians that get hurt. It's always lesbians that get cancelled. It's always lesbians.
Is there an area of activity in which you focus your efforts to resist gender identity ideology? Where has that taken you?
Originally, I went to LGB Alliance Australia meetings, and I'm a supporter now. I'm also forming a direct action group called LGB Tasmania, and our website is lgbtasmania.org. And I have 6 members at the moment. And I've been out and about talking to different people and people in my area, and they actually seem very much like me. they don't agree with this gender identity ideology. So that's pretty good for where I'm living. And for somebody who belongs to the church, we're pretty much old-fashioned at church. We believe in a God made a male and a female, and that's all that there really is to it. So that's really helped me as well to shelter me from gender ideology and all this nonsense as well.
What kind of opposition are you facing?
The local Examiner newspaper and the ABC ran me down. They ran the LGB Alliance down too as well, because I made the quote that trans women are men. My church is very supporting of me. My family is supporting of me. Cole is supportive of me. LGB Alliance Australia and CAT is supportive of me. Women Speak Tasmania is supportive of me. Other than the Examiner and the ABC, everything's been pretty good so far.
What are your next steps, and what do you think attendees could be doing?
I'm going to hit the street. Okay, I'm going to hit the street. I'm going to hit the ground running. And I'm going to do the biggest protest, bigger than Ben-Hur itself, down in Launceston. Support me, stand up and be heard. Don't let people silence you. Get louder. Get louder. Get louder until they hear us. Get louder. Make some noise.
To introduce our last but not least speaker, Professor Emerita of Transnational Studies, Bronwyn Winter, lives on the land of the Gadigal and Wangal Peoples of the Eora Nation. She is a long-time feminist, lesbian and trade union activist in France, Australia, briefly in the UK and transnationally. Her interdisciplinary academic work has covered various themes, but addressing various forms of violence against women has always been a core preoccupation. Welcome, Bronwyn. Could you give us some details of your involvement in advocating for women's sex-based rights, please?
Yeah, just a little footnote to what Jessica was saying about Rodney Croome. I've just finished a book which published earlier this year, giving a feminist critique of the political economy of same-sex marriage. Not so much about the motivations of individuals, but how states and markets appropriate the issue and make themselves look bright and shiny while doing terrible things to lesbians, gays, and women more generally on other levels. Rodney Croome was one of the main advocates, as you surely know, Jessica, for same-sex marriage in Australia. I wonder if he's now calling it same-gender marriage. One can ask the question, because now he's talking about trans rights, so same-sex marriage would not, you'd have to change the lingo. Anyway, that was just a little aside. I am a beneficiary, bizarrely, of the horrible, horrible year of pandemic that was last year, and the horrible, horrible year both staff and students had in our universities all over the country during the pandemic year. I'm sure you've heard about it. It was just awful. People, you know, students fell apart, staff fell apart, we were overworked, we were harassed, we were treated abominably. And I worked at, you know, one of the major G08 universities, so you can imagine how much worse it may have been in others, because it was pretty bad at Sydney. But I got a redundancy package because they were getting rid of staff. I was close to retirement anyway. I said, yeah, sure, I'll take the money and run. So that's been a very, very strange year. To cut the story short, I've been a feminist and lesbian activist since forever. Since I was very young. My older sister was part of the first women's liberation group in Sydney, and I think I owe it to her that that I'm a feminist to a very great extent. I've done all sorts of things. I ended up working at a university sort of by accident, but I decided to work there because I wanted to write and make feminist sense and get paid for it. I thought that would be a good idea. I do want to mention, before I hand the mic back to Janet, I'd actually like to dedicate my participation this evening to a wonderful radical lesbian activist in Quebec by the name of Joanne Coulombe, who died very suddenly and tragically of cancer last week. And she is much mourned across the Atlantic and throughout the Francophone world. And she has been one of a core of very, very active lesbians who in Canada and in Quebec in particular, who have been active around lesbian rights, lesbian sex-based rights, and very critical of gender ideology. Joanne was a wonderful woman, full of grace and humor and generosity. And I just wanted her to be remembered here tonight because there are casualties of all sorts, and Joanne has been one, unfortunately, to cancer, died far too young.
What made you first realise transgenderism was a threat to women's rights?
You know, Janice Raymond first published The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male in 1979. Some of us thought at the time that she was overstating the case, but in fact she was prophetic. She saw it coming and she was right. I think I was aware of transsexual, transgender transsexuals way back then, and some still call them transsexuals like Miranda Yardley. But I think I was aware it was a threat around 20 years ago, and there were a couple of things happened around that time. First, I was president of my union branch at the University of Sydney around the turn of this millennium. And there was a transgender individual, a student who beat up a security guard, very tall person, a trans-identified male, and with some serious drug, alcohol, and mental health problems, beat up the security guard, then went to the Anti-Discrimination Board and landed this guy in hospital. He landed this guy in hospital. And the university went to the Anti-Discrimination Board. The university hates being taken to the Anti-Discrimination Board. And the security guards sort of got a little slap on the wrist about it. They got reprimanded. It took another several incidents with this person being drunk and disorderly, trashing student residences and so on, was finally excluded from the university. And that for me was a first big warning sign that it's okay for somebody to be abusive, beat people up, but they can claim that they are transgender minority and persecuted, and everyone sort of shushes it down and quiets it down. That was the first warning bell. Another warning bell was Sappho's Party. Some of you may have heard of Sappho's Party, a lesbian gathering in South Australia. A male to trans individual took action against the party because he wasn't invited. And rather than trying to do anything else, like negotiate, tried to have the whole event shut down. Very, very lengthy litigation ensued. The lesbians won, but it took a long time. It took great lesbian feminist lawyers working pro bono and so on. And there have been constant legal challenges to lesbian space and lesbian gatherings. So those sorts of events. Then there were the Yogyakarta principles, which I can talk about at greater length a bit later. Most of you would know about them. And this sort of seeping into the UN, we had SOGI, or I like to call it SOGI, which is sexual orientation and gender identity, suddenly got lumped together in UN speak. And I thought, okay, we're in a really dangerous place now. This is scary. So that was the mid-2000s that this was happening. So I suppose, and I've never really wanted to work directly on this myself because there are so many other things going on for women in the world, and I felt this was just annoying. But I've been dragged kicking and screaming into talking about it because it has become so dangerous to us. And as Jessica said, it's particularly dangerous to lesbians. It's lesbian erasure.
Is there an area of activity in which you focus your efforts to resist gender identity ideology? Where has that taken you?
Sort of in spite of myself, because I am so annoyed having to give this issue time and attention. Somebody earlier this evening was saying, what the hell, what's it going to take? I think it might have been Anna was saying, what the hell is it going to take? Is it going to be Laurel Hubbard? What's it going to take to peak people? To women in the UK, I say Karen White. Yes, you would all know about the male sexual offender who got himself transferred to a women's prison, and guess what he went and did? And that was a notorious case. I think it might have been in 2017. UK women can correct me if I'm wrong. We have Kira Bell, we have the denunciation of the Tavistock clinic. So I don't know what it's going to take, because those things should have already piqued people. Evie Amati in Sydney, that should have piqued people, but it hasn't. So it's really quite scary. So I've sort of been dragged kicking and screaming, and now kicking and screaming about it. People ask me to talk about it. I was, a lot of you would know of the IQ2 debate that took place in Sydney in 2016, organised by the Ethics Centre in conjunction with the Mardi Gras, because even Mardi Gras was saying, this is going a bit far, we need to talk. And I was thinking, good idea, let's talk. And at that stage, I had some optimism that we would be able to talk and find a way through it, but that optimism has since completely disappeared. I had so much feedback on that Ethics Centre debate from people who were too intimidated to speak out, and said, thank you for speaking. I don't have the courage to. I'm being bullied. My daughter's at university in nursing. She's being told to respect transgender, and all about the sorts of things that Madeline would know very, very well about medical care of women and so on. So I thought, well, now I have a responsibility to keep talking about this, because when you start speaking about it, people draw courage from it, people start thinking about it, and maybe people in their own way will also start speaking and acting in their own corners. And it takes a sort of series of little drops, you know, not to make perhaps an ocean, but to make a big wave. I also wanted to acknowledge Lavino talking about the conference in Brisbane. I was aware of that, and I do remember the kerfuffle at the time. I wasn't there, but I do remember the fuss about it. And so, yeah, it was happening in the lesbian community in Australia well before this millennium. But yeah, so that's what I do. I talk. I don't want to write about it, because quite frankly, it gives me the shits to talk about this stuff. It exhausts me. It's intimidating. It's scary. The IQ2 debate was terrifying. I was absolutely terrified getting up on that stage. I'm a bit less scared now because I'm getting so many echoes and good on news, but it's really exhausting to talk about this stuff. It's really exhausting to stand against the tide. And we've just got to keep doing it and doing it together. We can't leave each other alone in front of this.
And of course, the loss of women's studies across Australia began in the 1980s. So that kind of has taken out a lot of women's capacity to learn about this stuff. Can I ask you what kind of opposition you've been facing?
Yes, Liz in Kent, it is indeed very frightening. And I want to thank Janet for raising the lesbian space debate. Somehow I just managed to obliterate that from my memory, but I was completely in the middle of it. So I was part of the committee. We had big debates about it. And the reason I wanted to come back to that is that it completely divided the lesbian community in Sydney at that time. It was quite vitriolic. And what I think frightens me the most about the trans agenda and what it's doing to women is, I have to use the word, the handmaidens. The women who ally themselves with these movements against women. What happened in Sydney in 1993, what happened in Brisbane in 1994, what has happened since in other fora, what happened at the event we held at the University of Sydney last February when trans activists marched in and yelled at us, a number of you were there. It was women screaming at us. It was young women screaming at older women. It was young women pushing women over. I suppose the biggest obstacle, the biggest opposition I face, the men, I expect them to oppose me. I expect the trans activists to oppose me. It's the women that pick up this and carry it forward with such vehemence, such hatred of other women. That is the thing I find the most difficult to deal with. You know, I can get a crank call from a trans or get torn or turf on social media. That's not going to hurt me. But it's these women that, you know, sort of pick up swords and march out to attack other women, like the women on the City of Sydney Council that have, you know, evicted Anna and the Feminist Legal Clinic, and for, you know, when they're doing such terrific work for women, like what's happening to Madeline. with breastfeeding. What's happening to Jessica in Tasmania? It is women who are getting stuck into other women. And that has always undone me. There's not been the only debate we've had in the feminist movement. We've had debates about prostitution and various other things in the feminist movement where women have been vitriolic towards other women. But this takes the cake. And these are the collaborators. There was a conversation about the Nazi regime in which Lorraine was participating in the chat. These are the collaborators, and they're the people who are going to do us in. And they're the people we need to reach and convince and talk to somehow. And I don't know how we do that, but we've got to keep trying.
What are your next steps, and what do you think attendees could be doing?
Well, getting louder clearly, as Jessica recommends. Jessica mentioned COLE before. That's the Coalition of Activist Lesbians, which is an Australian organisation co-founded by Eileen Pittaway in the, I think 1993, it was early 90s anyway, and it is one of the few lesbian organisations, it certainly was the first in the world to have special consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the UN. That means we get an in as an NGO to the UN. There are about 5,500 organisations across the world that have that status, from the most bizarrely right wing to the trans to the lesbian and so on, but we're a fairly minority. But anyway, that's what COLE is. So I'm doing some work with them a little bit. But I was very touched by what some of the people in the chat were saying and what Madeline was saying just now. It is complicated, and women fall for the poor little puppy narrative. They fall for it so easily. We are educated to look after the poor little puppies and the poor little waifs and the poor little men and the poor little everyone except ourselves. And so if someone comes along with a poor little puppy narrative, we fall for it hook, line and sinker. And if some nasty woman says, no, they're not poor little puppies, they're vicious, savage dogs and, you know, should be held back, then they're very loath to believe that. So I suppose, picking up on what Madeline was saying, it's important to try and reach people where they are. I've tried to do that with students. I've been branded a TERF by some. I have had others really appreciate what I've been trying to say. I no longer have students with whom I have these conversations. I've had it with a lot of my colleagues. A lot of my colleagues are much wiser about this issue in the university. Some of them, a lot of people just don't know what's going on, or they don't want to believe what's going on. So I suppose getting information out there and talking to people in ways that touch them. Somebody talked about being piqued when her daughter, something to do with her daughter. I think it was Sue Gittins in the chat. It's sort of getting that situation that is going to pique people, that is going to get people listening to you. And that's a very, very slow process. It's a one-on-one process. It's a small conversation process. And it's certainly not sort of going out there brandishing, you know, yes, getting out in the street and shouting is important, Jessica, but there are so many other ways in which we need to have these conversations, because people are running away from them. They're either running away from them because they're scared, they don't think they know the issues, they don't think they're across the issues, or they haven't been touched personally by them, or because they bought the poor little puppy narrative, or because they're just completely confused. And yes, one has to find a way in to try and undo some of that confusion, so people have the space to think about it and to talk about it and not feel judged, but also the space to speak up when they have felt intimidated. As I said before, I think it's really important to let people know, yes, you can speak up and you're not going to die. Or, you know, if you die, we'll die together, but maybe you shouldn't put it that way. But anyway, you can speak up and know this isn't Nazi Germany yet. So yes, you can speak up, and we may be able to change things if we do.
The importance of naming women in law. Why is this important for well-intended laws, such as introducing coercive control as a form of violence? Why should these laws address women specifically?
Unfortunately, what I've seen is that a lot of our laws, domestic violence laws and discrimination laws that were enacted to protect women, I mean, that's really why we put them in, those specialist laws, because we do know that domestic violence is overwhelmingly committed by men, and discrimination law was meant to be enacting CEDAW, so to protect women against sex discrimination. Of course, the language that was used for both those types of legislation was sort of gender neutral, sex neutral, we have to say now, because that's not used the word gender, but it was in gender neutral language. And so what we're finding as time goes on, more and more, it's the men who are accessing this, using the legislation and weaponizing it against the women that it's intended to protect. And often it's the worst types of men. It's the perpetrators of serious domestic violence who get in there and are bringing applications for apprehended violence orders against women. And in discrimination matters, it's really, you know, the trolls, the blokes, the men's rights activists who are getting in there and they're bringing discrimination claims against women who don't do what they want. It might be someone like the Jessica Yaniv is a classic example, I suppose. They're using the discrimination laws. So I keep thinking about this and I think, well, what's the solution? Because, you know, women think, oh, it's fair, we want to be equal-handed. I mean, in the family court as well, everything, there's no difference between men and women. You know, increasingly the idea is, you know, we're all parents, and there's no distinction made for the fact that, for instance, women gestate and give birth and have a particular biological attachment to the child. So I just keep thinking that I don't think there is a solution. I think while we continue to try to be terribly fair and equal-handed, men are going to continue to use this legislation and more cleverly use it against us. And the women, for instance, coercive control, for instance, the women who, it's very much needed, but the women who most need it are the least likely to access it. They're least likely to rock up to the police and say, I'm being coercively controlled. I mean, you only have to use common sense. If someone is a victim of coercive control, they're not going to be, you know, their self-esteem is affected, their ability to do this is impacted. So they're not going to be going out and using legislation. So yes, that's why I've come to the conclusion that we actually need to lobby for legislation that is specific to protection of women. So yeah, it's a very hard sell, but I think it's a feminist that has to do it, because people react against it and say, oh, but feminists fought so hard, you know, for everything to be equal. We can't now be asking for something that's specific to women, but I think we need to.
We've fought hard for equality. We did not fight hard for sameness. We fought hard for opportunities for women to get what they need when they need it. And sometimes men and women do not need the same things in health, for example, yes? Women's health needs and men's health needs are different. And I'm not just talking reproductive health. Women experience heart attacks differently. Women are more likely to get some diseases. Men are more likely to get others, and so on and so forth. So, and sport, you know, there are, because we're a sexually dimorphic species, there are physical differences that advantage men in some areas and advantage women in others. You don't see a whole bunch of male to trans people queuing up to compete in rhythmic gymnastics, do you? Because they'd lose. They're competing where they're going to win, where their muscle mass, where their greater skeletons, where their greater speed is going to give them an advantage over women in sport. So equality doesn't mean sameness. Equality means having the opportunities to participate fully in society as fully as men do. So I think we need to actually keep reminding people what we mean by equality as feminists. We've never meant sameness. And arguing for sex-based rights is not differentialism. It is arguing for what women need because only women need it. And men are trying to stop us having what we need.
What can we do about the change of language in public schools education, and who's leading the language change in New South Wales?
I have not been involved in schools. The sort of people you probably need to ask that question of are people like Maria O'Halloran, who's former president of the New South Wales Teachers Federation, and other people who are conscious of this issue or who are working in the school system now. I know that there has been, what was that thing, the education about, I can't remember what it was called, but there was this whole little brochure that was going around schools a few years ago and was much criticized, and it was pushing a trans agenda in schools. And there was a lot of controversy about that. Some of the pushback came from the really, sorry?
Safe schools, Bronwyn?
Safe schools, that was the one, yes, safe schools. We could nickname it unsafe schools because it was pushing a trans agenda. There was a lot of controversy, a lot of opposition, particularly from the religious right. I haven't heard much about how it's faring these days. We don't yet have ACON doing a Stonewall like they have in the UK, getting contracts to go and, you know, educate businesses and schools and so on. But I'm not quite sure. Part of the problem, Lily, is money. these trans lobbyists are extremely well bankrolled. They get a lot of money. I was talking with a lesbian activist in France, and among all the funding that goes to alphabet soup LGBTQIA organizations in Europe, lesbian-only organizations get like 2 or 3% of that funding. Trans organizations probably get the lion's share, or so-called gay organizations that push trans agendas. They get a lot of public and private philanthropic funding. And with that public and private funding, they are able to do an awful lot. They are able to engage in litigation. They are able to set up programs, to go into businesses, do the whole rainbow tick thing that they do around businesses now. Can you get a rainbow? The most exploitative employers in the world can now get rainbow ticks for being LGBTQI friendly. So that doesn't answer your question, Lily, but I suppose the answer is to talk to teachers. Again, those one-on-one conversations are incredibly important. Talking to teachers, talking to parents. Somebody talked about how something that happened to her daughter was what piqued her. And often parents will respond when their kids are put in danger. So I suppose talking to the parents, and there are a lot of, there's a lot of, I've heard testimony from a lot of mothers whose daughters, because in schools this is particularly affecting girls, as we know. It's girls that are being transed. It's girls who are a little bit butch or don't conform, or in some way not the ideal girl, who are being transed. And gender dysphoria among young girls has skyrocketed. And so mothers of these girls are starting to get very concerned, some of them. Yeah, sometimes it's the fathers who are more concerned than the mothers, but there is concern, and these parents sometimes have nowhere to go. So I think it's really important to connect with parents who feel concerns, and to connect with teachers, because like I said before, a lot of people just don't know what's going on. They're getting the media stuff from the ABC and the Sydney Morning Herald and SBS and so on and so forth. They're getting all this media stuff. They're getting the shiny things put out by ACON and so on and so forth, and Stonewall in the UK. And they just don't know what's really going on. So we have to tell them. And we have to connect with those who are expressing concern. And as Madeline was saying before, gently have those conversations in ways that they feel they have space to express themselves. I don't know a quicker way to do this, because getting out there with banners, hitting the streets, as Jessica said, yes, of course, that's important. But I don't think that's the way we're going to turn this around. Ultimately, it's not the only way we're going to turn this around.
We'd like to hear from you about positive consent in law. What do you think?
I think the whole consent narrative is a bit of a tricky one, because I mean, it all sounds very good, but of course they say that women consent to all sorts of things. So prostitution, it's a matter of, they say it's all okay because the woman consented, and surrogacy, it's all okay because the woman consented. And now it's getting to the point of strangulation is okay because the woman consented, right? And they're creating more criminal offences where they're using consent as an element, because it's a perfect way out, because the woman just gets cross-examined. It's put to her, you love being strangled, don't you? Or you love having your jaw broken, or whatever it is. And even if the man kills the woman, he can say, oh, she loved rough sex. So, it was all okay. So the whole consent thing, while it sounds good, doesn't really solve anything for women, because they'll always claim the woman consented. They're trying to, there was a whole lot of stuff over this. We're strengthening the sexual assault legislation here in New South Wales, that if you have to require, the woman has to have said yes, and that will make the difference. I support it. Let's strengthen it all we want, but in the end, men lie. So at the moment they'll say, the trouble is at the moment, men can get off sexual assault by saying, oh, well, so the woman, like in the Lazarus case, the woman said she wasn't consenting and the court accepted that, but they also accepted that he didn't know she wasn't consenting. And that's why they've kind of strengthened it, where you need to have affirm, some actual, yes means yes. He need to actually ask her. So that's what they've done. But I think if that law had been in place, he would have just said that she had said yes. I'm a bit cynical that it will cure the problem, but yes, it's a step in the right direction, I guess, to try and make it, but I don't think it's the correct way. I think there's other things we can do. For instance, I think if there's serious injuries involved, I don't think we need to worry about whether she was consenting, especially when she's a young a young girl who was extremely inebriated, for instance, and a virgin, and, you know, really, it's just, that was a terrible case. And there were lots of ways that case could have been won, but the legal team for Lazarus found every way around it. And I just think that's the nature of the legal system, that they'll find a way around it. Yeah, they don't want to give women power, basically, to be able to say, look, I mean, I think if someone wants to break their jaw or strangle someone, even if it's consensual, I think you take a risk. If you're going to do physical harm to someone as part of your sexual practice, and then, you know, afterwards the person goes, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. Well, I actually think, you know, we've got to draw a line somewhere. I mean, the public health system shouldn't have to be, you know, carrying the consequences of people, you know, beating women up and causing them serious and permanent injuries, because it's a fetish. It's crazy stuff.